if you look at the natural progression of the way the brain develops over time, it kind of tracks how humans should have been behaving throughout most of human history, right? So you're a kid, you're wandering around learning through play and observation, and your brain's optimized for that.
Welcome back to another episode of the Peak Performance Life podcast. Today, I am so excited to be speaking with Charan Ranganath, PhD. He is the author of a book called Why We Remember. We are going to be talking about improving memory, focus, all of those things that are so important as we age. We talk a lot about health on this podcast. Well, when you live a long, healthy life, you also want to make sure you have a brain that works well. And we're going to be talking about different things like memories and how memories affect different parts of your life. Why We Remember is the name of the book. And so Charan Ranganath is a best-selling author and leading neuroscientist. He is a professor at the Center for Neuroscience and Department of Psychology and director of the Dynamic Memory Lab at the University of California at Davis. And for over 25 years, he has studied the mechanisms in the brain that allow us to remember past events using brain imaging techniques, computational modeling, and studies of patients with memory disorders. He has been recognized with several awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Vannevar Bush Faculty Fellowship. And he is also a songwriter and guitarist, as you can see if you're watching on video, the guitars in the background. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Talor. I'm very excited.
Yeah, this is such a fascinating topic. Let's talk a little bit about why did you, I know you've been researching this kind of stuff for 25 years or more now. What led you to write this book, and what are some of the kind of interesting things that you came across when deciding to write this book?
Well, it's interesting because, like, whenever you're asked, why did you do something, you always have to look back on memory to generate that story, right? So there's multiple ways to think about that. I mean, one is sometimes people ask me, how long did it take you? And I say either 3 years or 30 years, depending on how you look at it. You know? So I knew I wanted to write a book for a long time. My feeling was always that you do the science, but it needs to get to people. And it just so happened that I was approached about writing a book in March 2020. And I said, oh, well, I'm not quite ready. I don't know. And then the lockdowns happened a couple weeks later. And I said, okay, I think I'm ready to do this. And, you know, I was really energized by this because there were just people needed to hear from scientists so badly. And, you know, I think there was a desperate vacuum for it. And then people who filled the vacuum were like very anti-science, you know? And so for me, I really added some motivation to do this, to show people, hey, science is your friend. It has all sorts of valuable stuff in it. And it can really provide some deep ways to think about how you can live your life better. Is that a good enough answer?
Yes, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about the book itself, Why We Remember. So why do we remember? Let's start with that question.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I use that title is because, I mean, there's many reasons, but again, one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize is that this isn't a self-help book. Self-help books are always predicated on the assumption that you're broken, or you need to be fixed, or you're fine, but you need to optimize, you need to improve. And that's not what this book is about. Basically, people will tell me, oh, I'm so forgetful. Why am I so forgetful? Can you help me? But the research shows over and over and over again that most of what we experience in life will be forgotten. And so rather than asking why we forget, the real question is, why do we remember? And you can ask that in a very mundane way, like, why do I remember where I put my keys? But you can also ask it in a deeper way. Why do we have this capability in the first place? Because most of the things that we associate with memory aren't the things that our brain necessarily evolved to do. And so I try to answer both those questions throughout the book and really get into why our brains are the way they are and how it plays out in so many aspects of our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting when you think back, like, you know, in my early years, for example, I have very few memories, right, of like my younger years, very few. But then, like, when in third grade, when someone scratched someone else in the face and they were bleeding, like, I remember that, but I don't remember, it's like just certain things that stand out. And you talk a lot about how memory can sometimes serve us or not serve us in certain ways. And then I've also heard, again, this is probably some made up stat. I don't know how you could ever really know what the actual stat here is, but like, when we think about the past, half of what we think about is stuff we're just making up in our head or whatever anyway, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say everything that we think and feel is made up in our head. So,
Yeah.
I mean, when people talk about living in a simulation, I mean, that's what our brains are doing, is we're taking in little bits and pieces of our world and generating this internal, view of how the world could be. And there's all sorts of things we don't sense, right? Like I don't sense infrared light, I don't sense ultrasonic vibrations. So the kind of the movie that plays in my head when I walk around the world doesn't include these things. It just includes the stuff I can understand. So memory is more along these lines in the sense that we know that people do remember bits and pieces of their past very well, and people are generally very accurate in how they remember things. But what the brain is designed to do is not to kind of maintain a constant recording of all our life, but rather to form these little bits and pieces of information and memory. And then what we can do is we can use the knowledge we already have to piece it together into a story. But that story is not a replay of what happened. It's our attempt to imagine how things could have happened. And what you find is that as we, progress through life, you can look back at the same event from a different perspective, and you put together that story differently. So what I say in the book is memory isn't like a photograph, it's like a painting. And so the painting will have some realistic details that are faithful to its subject. And the painting can also have some stuff that's distorted and not quite right. And then a lot of it just reflects the perspective of the observer. That's neither true nor false. I could stand from one perspective and do a painting of a church, and I can go from a different perspective and produce a different painting. Neither one of those is right. It just reflects how we're seeing the world at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. How have you seen people use this to their detriment, and how have you seen people use this to their advantage, I guess, right? Are there any kind of strategies there?
You mean use the constructive aspects of memory, or do you mean just like in general, like how memory can like kind of have negative effects on our life versus positive effects?
Yeah. So, for example, like, yeah, people who maybe have gotten into a downward spiral or a depression, or
Mm.
right. How many people, so many people these days,
Oh
right,
yeah.
talk about they don't feel good, they have depression, right? And a lot of that could be because they're dwelling on some past things, or maybe not utilizing their past in a more productive way.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, one of the most pervasive symptoms in depression is rumination. And what
Mm,
is rumination? It's basically pulling up negative past memories and sort of chewing on them for long periods of time and cycling on them over and over again. Right. So, what's going on there? Well, if you're feeling bad, that's a mental context that you're in. And as I talk about in the book, our memories for our life are associated with different contexts. We have the emotional state, you have the time, you have the place, you have the physical feeling of being in a particular event. And so when you are in a particular kind of mental state or context, that can be a cue that sort of shines a light on some memories that you have, but darkens other memories, right? So if I'm in a negative mood and it's a very, very negative mood, I'm in a dark place, am I going to find it easier to remember positive things or negative things?
Right.
Yeah, so negative things. Sorry, it was
right. Yeah.
It wasn't a rhetorical question, but I totally get why you thought that. But anyway, so you're going to remember more negative things, right? Well, when people remember negative events, that actually worsens your mood. So when your mood is worse, now you remember more negative events, and so it becomes this vicious cycle, right? And people will often have the sense that it's like, oh, if I just like figure these things out, or if I just like kind of atone for the mistakes that I made, or blah, 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 it'll feel better. But that's just not true, you know? And I don't want to say that somebody who's depressed is depressed because they're just choosing to regurgitate memories. That's not the point. But the point is that depression can be a cycle that's very hard to pull yourself out of, because it involves this heavy memory component. And I think the thing to do is, and, just as an aside, most people who are not depressed actually have a very rosy, somewhat inaccurately rosy view of their life. People tend to remember more positive events on average, and when they remember them, they remember themselves more positively than necessarily it really was. So, these biases can work both ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry, go on. I kind of gave a long answer.
No, absolutely. I mean, but it made me think too, in terms of like, this is why, in my opinion, it's so powerful when you do gratitude and positive visualizations and gratitude and saying everything that you're grateful for, because you're kind of force functioning this positive memory cycle when you're doing that, right?
This is one of the biggest pieces of advice I give. I don't have tons of advice for people, but one piece of advice that I try to give is, you can basically take that mechanism that we already have and kind of hack it using gratitude practices. So I personally struggle with the global idea of a gratitude practice, in the sense that it's like, it seems like a good idea, but if I think about, I'm thankful I don't have cancer today, then I start to think about, well, I could get cancer. Maybe something's wrong. Maybe I do have cancer. I don't know it. And so you could go off the deep end if you want to. But what I found was really helpful for me personally, and this is, again, one of those things that kind of became more clear as I was writing the book, is if I ask myself at the end of the day, think of one positive thing that happened. Doesn't matter what it is. It can be as small as I want. In fact, small is great, just pull up one thing. And often at the end of the day, I've been teaching, I've been in meetings, I've got like this torrential flood of emails, and I'm just tired, But if I work hard enough, I can often pull up one thing. And then what happens is I feel a little better. And then I think of other things that were positive during the day. And sometimes there will be a huge one that will pop up during the day, And what happens is that you start to push the cycle in the opposite direction, where pulling up one positive memory opens the door to all of these other positive memories, right? And, life's full of both negative and positive things. And you don't want to like forget all the negative things that happen to you. But it is good to be grateful for all the things that are going well. And I feel like gratitude kind of emerges naturally from just taking the time to remember it.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I will say, I got certified back in 2007 in neuro-linguistic programming and hypnosis. And one of the things that they taught was never, like, for example, even in conversations, you don't want to use words that would trigger the person so you wouldn't want to use a negative word, right? So in terms of like, you wouldn't say, I'm grateful I don't have cancer, because that triggers you to think about cancer, right? Instead, you would say, I'm so grateful for my health and happiness, right? I'm healthier and happier. I'm healthier so I visualize, for example, that I'm healthier at age 49 than I was at age 39, right? And so I'll visualize these kind of things, but I'm very careful not to. It goes kind of really hand in hand with your work, is like, in NLP, they gave the example, if you say, don't think of a pink elephant, well, everyone just thought of a pink elephant, right? So
Mhm.
you can't say, you got to be careful too with your language when you're talking to people. I found for myself over the
Mhm.
years, it's something that's helped me a lot, is to be aware, right? Like, a salesman who's like, look, I really don't want you to be afraid and uncomfortable right now, right? Like, you just
Mhm.
triggered them to be afraid and uncomfortable, rather than saying like, I want you to feel calm and relaxed with your decision, for example, would be maybe a better way to word it.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's key, absolutely. And I think that you can still, even with these more broad kinds of ways of conceptualizing gratitude, you can still turbocharge that with memory, right? So you imagine yourself in the future being healthy, like, I'm going to be healthy at the age of 60. Well, it really helps if you can remember, times in your life where you felt like you were feeling good, times in your life where you did things that made you feel like you're taking care of yourself or something like that. One of the big discoveries that's come up in the past 20 years about memory is just how deeply intertwined memory is with imagination. And what I mean by that is it's something that researchers had talked about for a long time, but now with brain imaging, it's just become totally apparent that if I scan you while I say, hey, tell me about something that happened last year, I'll see some activation in many parts of your brain. Many of these areas are called the default network. You'll also see it in the hippocampus, this area that's very important for memory. And now I say, okay, well, imagine yourself 1 year in the future. How are you going to feel? What do you want to be? Project the person that you want to be 1 year from now. You'll activate exactly that same network. There'll be some differences, of course, but more or less, you're activating the same network. And there's even work to suggest that people with memory problems often have a hard time imagining themselves in the future. That's partly because memory is this allows us to place ourselves on a timeline. And so it allows us both to travel back to the future, but also conceptualize who we are to predict where things will go or where things could go or where we want them to go, right? So people often talk about manifesting abundance or whatever, it's like the key word nowadays. It's like, but if you want to manifest something, it's really good to be able to pull the right memory so that you can synthesize a good vision of where you want to be.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And so, yeah, I mean, these are great tips, kind of like gratitude, focusing on things you're grateful for at the end of every day, kind of force functioning that to focus on that. And then, like you mentioned with dwelling in the past, I'm curious your opinion, not to generate any hate mail here, but I've always thought that, traditional psychotherapy where you just sit in a room and talk about your problems over and over and over, for me, I never resonated with that. I always resonated more with, and again, there's different terminology. I'm sure there's psychotherapists that don't just talk about the past the whole time, but more of a process of focusing on what are we going to do different in the future, or how can we, right? So more like coaching, where someone's coaching on how can, or maybe cognitive behavioral therapy is maybe another example. I don't know a whole lot about it other than reading a couple books on it, but what's your opinion of like traditional therapy talking about the past versus maybe other types of therapy that you've maybe seen be a little more effective?
Yeah. I mean, having done therapy, as a therapist early in my, training as in graduate school, I definitely had some real experience with it. And as a neuroscientist and studying memory, I have like a different window on it. But basically, like a big part of what's called insight oriented psychotherapy is processing memories, processing your past and being able to, achieve insight into it, right? So there's a very powerful part of that form of therapy in the sense that if I have like something that is, an event that's part of my life story that tells me that I'm a failure, processing this with someone else, just the act of sharing that memory will change it. Because when we remember something, the memory can actually change. Now it has some traces of what happened the last time you remember it. So I've now shared this memory with you. But just to explain it to you, I've had to take these feelings and put them into words. That act alone is very powerful. But then if you're on my side and you're a good therapist, you're going to reflect that back to me in a way that's integrated and processed in a way that can take that same information, but allow me to see it from a different perspective, your perspective, right? So remember, I was talking about memory so much about perspective. Well, if I can look at my own experiences from a different perspective, that's very powerful in helping me change not the memory per se, but change the kind of narrative that I put together about that memory. And often what can happen is you remember other things that you'd forgotten about before because you get this reminder from somebody who says, oh, was there anything else going on other than the fact that you had done badly in this talk? And, you go, oh, well, actually, a couple of people afterwards told me that I did a good job. I just didn't believe them or something, and I've seen cases like this where this happens. So that's all very good. And so I talk about in the book how therapy, and especially group therapy for people who've endured trauma, can be very powerful in helping people reshape those narratives. Where I think things are insufficient is there's two parts of it. So one is there's a school of thought that if I pull up a negative memory that's buried deep down inside you, and I manage to just root it out, you will be better. It's sort of like the truth will set you free. And that's not really true. So what happens is often people will just sit and just talk about these negative things for an hour every week. And that's not productive. If anything, that can reinforce all the stories that you're telling yourself, and it can strengthen the negative memories. So it's very critical to not simply just talk about it, but to really actively collaborate on reframing it and and supplementing your story with other kinds of perspectives and other parts of the story that you've been leaving out. And so that's the cognitive part of cognitive therapy. Now, the behavior part of cognitive therapy addresses the other problem, which is I can often know things, but I don't feel it, and it doesn't affect what I do. So insight in, changing your beliefs isn't enough. I used to work with people with obsessive compulsive disorder, and we would tell people, okay, here's all these facts about, OCD. You can basically lick the floor. You're not going to die of a disease. It's there's all sorts of things that you can do to teach people. I actually remember this is probably why it's a good thing I didn't become a real therapist. It's I remember once in the group, I was eating potato chips. I was an intern. So the other guy was running the group. I was eating potato chips, and one of the potato chips fell on the ground, and then I just picked it up and ate it. And everyone was looking at me with horror. So yeah, but anyway, it was so it was actually a teachable moment, right? Because I could say, hey, look, you can do this too. But even though they would know that, they still felt oh, I have to wash my hands. Oh, I have to count to 7, or they have all these rituals that they have to do to calm themselves down. And part of the problem is that there is this conscious knowledge, but there's a gap, there's a difference between things that we know and our ability to translate knowledge into action. So there's an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. It's an area that I've spent a good amount of time studying. And if you go through basically any disorder you can think of, but it's any neurological disorder you could think of, and certainly every psychiatric disorder, you will see dysfunction of the prefrontal cortex. It's just exquisitely vulnerable. It's one of the last areas of the brain to fully develop connectionally, and it's one of the first areas to start to decline as we get older. So it's this super important place, and it's very delicate and fragile. And the prefrontal cortex, what you find is that when people have damage or dysfunction of the prefrontal cortex, they'll often know what they're supposed to do, but they don't do it. There's a very famous case in my field of somebody who's being seen by a neurologist, and the neurologist says, okay, you're going to be doing some diabetes test, or you have diabetes. Just don't drink water for the next 20 minutes. I'm going to leave. And then the doctor comes back and the patient's drinking the water. And so the doctor says, well, what did I tell you before I left? And the guy's like, oh, you told me not to drink the water. And of course, and it's like very easy to look at a patient like that and say, well, what are you doing? But we do this stuff all the time in real life too. That gap between knowledge and action is a chasm, really. And the prefrontal cortex is what allows us to do it. So in the case of, different kinds of psychotherapy, the goal is to build that bridge. And to build that bridge, you have to actually go beyond just talking about things, but to actually doing things.
Right.
And that's where the prefrontal cortex can start to rewire these connections so that you can actually do things in the real world and change your behavior. So for instance, in obsessive compulsive disorder, what we would say is, okay, well, we know that you're afraid of contamination. How about if you just I'm going to put a spoon of dirt on this counter. I want you to touch it, and I want you to hold on to it for as long, just basically keep going until you feel better. And what happens is that, you'll push people to their limit, and they go, I hate this. And then they have an aha moment and their body just sort of shuts down and their brain is sort of locked in this thing that, hey, I can do this. Now, then you escalate it and you keep going up and up. I dealt with a patient who had a driving phobia, and it was the same kind of thing. I said, first off was the insight-oriented therapy, and we went through it, and that was great. And for the driving part, what we did was I said, okay, well, here's this parking lot. I want you to just park the car, pull the car out, park the car, pull the car out. Do something so tedious that it becomes boring very easily. And so if you have a fear of it and then all of a sudden you're bored, now your brain's kind of locked into something. Then you can go, okay, here's go into the road, drive one block, and then turn back, in this residential street. Then you go, okay, well, go on the highway, get onto the highway, and then get off at the next exit and loop back, and you can basically do these things and just sort of gradually build people up. But it's that doing that really makes a big difference,
Yeah.
So it's a matter of translating what you know into the real world. And so you mentioned coaches and stuff, and I think that's like a valid contribution that coaches can make.
Yeah, I think I think exactly what you touched on, someone, whether it's a psychotherapist or a coach or whatever the name is, someone who can actually help you reframe, right? There's been so many instances where things have been reframed for me, and instantly, literally instantly, the way I think about it and the way I feel turns around just because someone presented it to me, in a different way. It's really incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, I hear all sorts of people tell me, can you help me forget? I have this trauma. Can you help me forget? And, I have a lot of empathy for people when they tell me that. But I also tell them, you don't want to forget. You want to change the way you feel when you remember, right? So all the traumas we've experienced, they've led us to this point right now. And I don't think you want to just have amnesia for those things, but you want to be able to reframe. You want to be able to think about that without having all these corrosive emotions that go with it. And that's a process, but reframing is a big part of it. And there's lots of people who will take these terrible experiences and they'll be like, I've become a lot stronger for having survived that. Or, I've this led me to do something that I wouldn't have done otherwise. I really heard a beautiful example when I was at this literary festival. There was a woman named Claire McIntosh. She's a murder mystery writer. And she did this book called I Promise It Won't Always Hurt Like This. And it was about how she was working on the police force. And then she has twins. And one of the twins gets sick and dies at the age of 5 months old. And they're going to the hospital for days and days on end. And then this tragically happens. And so, for a mother, that's like as bad as you can get, right? So she's devastated by this. And she quits her job, and then she starts writing. And she starts writing and writing and writing. And then next thing you know, she makes a book. And her book goes on the bestseller list, and she writes more books, and she's completely reinvented herself. And, you know, nobody in their right mind would say, see, look, that was a great thing. That wasn't. And I'm sure if you could do it again, you would still avoid having that loss. But the beautiful thing about the way she looked at that was she said, at least like losing him, it pushed me to do this new stage of life. And that was the greatest gift he could have given me. And I just, everybody in the room was like tearing up when she said this, and it's a very beautiful way of taking something terrible and, at least being able to reframe it in a way that doesn't make it less bad, but it makes it more something that you can integrate, right?
Right. I mean, I've seen it so many times, like even for myself personally, my own personal journey. In 2013, I had so much pain and inflammation in my fingers, hands, wrists, and arms. I literally thought this is the worst thing that could ever happen to me. I have a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old daughter. All I know the only way I've ever made money is over the internet and working on a computer all day. And I literally thought this is the worst thing that could ever happen to me. But actually, it ended up being the seed that helped started me on my health journey, created brands, based on, the pain and that I went through, that turned into a journey where I had to learn and figure out how to heal myself after years of trying everything in the book. And so, right, if I didn't, so what I thought in that moment was the worst thing that could ever possibly happen to me. And when I was down in despair, it was actually, looking back at it now, was actually the best thing that ever happened to me. It's incredible how it works out like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And even if it's not the best thing, even if even if it is the worst thing that's happened to you, that doesn't mean that you can't find meaning in it. That is, something that you can draw strength from.
Right.
People who were abused are survivors. People who made terrible mistakes can learn from those mistakes. I think the thing is that it's like when people don't reframe, they just get stuck, or they just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again, And
Right.
so that's a key part of it. And I think the lesson, which is a deep lesson in the science of memory, is the way things happen is not the same thing as the way we construct the story and the way we feel about what happened, right? I mean,
Right.
there's an objective set reality that of things that happened at this point in time. But when you remember it later, you're generating all this additional meaning, and you're selecting bits and pieces and throwing other bits and pieces out, and you're generating all these interpretations, and you have all these emotions about it, And that's the part I think that people sometimes confuse memory with objective reality, as opposed to something that has bits of reality, but is ultimately the meaning of it is subjective.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I think even sometimes I look back now at pictures of, when my daughters were really young and we went on vacation to a beach or something like that. And I'm like, oh man, those were such amazing times. What great memories. But when I actually think back to the moment, it was like, we're stressed out. We got 2 little kids. We're this, it wasn't all actually in the moment, as the memory of it was actually better than the moment of it almost. It's interesting.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And that's something that I talk about in the book, is that our memories are so fragmented, so selective. We don't remember that much of our lives, but that's the part that plays this inordinate role in how we see ourselves, in the present, how we see how things can go in the future, right? It's that remembering self. And so I always tell people, it's like, really ask yourself not just like what you want to do over the next year, but how do you want to remember this year later on? Do you want to remember like sitting around flicking through Instagram, or do you want to remember like going to the beach with your kids or something like that? And of course we all have a bunch of stuff in our lives that we have to do that we don't necessarily want to remember, like doing the dishes or something. But I think it's a good thing to think about, especially as we're still kind of at the beginning of the year, for people to think about what do they want to really remember at the end of this year.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting when you think back, things that you'll remember, trips, family things seem to be the things that you remember more than in the moment. You're like, I don't really want to go on this trip or do that or whatever. But then,
Mm-hmm.
if you actually think about like, hey, what will I remember? And that's why I really love Jesse Itzler. He's been on a lot of podcasts and wrote a bunch of books, but he talks about, he has a misogi every year, some big crazy thing that he's going to do, whether it be run some long race or do something that he's going to always remember that he did. And every year he's going to have one. And then he does memorable trips every 3 months or every month or something like that, where things that
Mm-hmm.
he's going to always remember. And so being conscious of creating those things that I guess will be the memories you remember later on, although it's so hard to know in the moment what that actually would be, right?
Yeah, but I think, making these investments is like something that, I mean, will often give you some kind of a high likelihood of a payoff. What I mean by that is like, when my daughter was very young, traveling with her was just an absolute pain in the ass. It was just like, and I think other people who have young kids, I remember like our first trip to Europe together, I was invited to a conference. And so we brought her along, and it was just like so hard. She was waking up at all these times and totally hyper, and we're trying to entertain her while we're just getting our bearings, and long times in the car and all this stuff. But I'm really glad we did that. I mean, those, even the things that didn't go well are great stories, that I hold on to.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that's very useful for people to think about, is that sometimes it's important to invest in these things. Obviously, you don't want to do something that makes you miserable, but if there's something that you feel like you would look back on and really be happy about it, and you could go and say, I know it's a pain to sit in traffic. I know it's a pain when my flight gets delayed, but later on, I'm probably not going to think about that. Then that's a good, and later on, I'm going to really place value on that. Well, that's a good thing, right? I mean, my daughter's grown up now. She's in grad school. And what I have from my time of parenting is just a whole string of memories, mostly of very cool things that we did together, but it's not a lot, right? It's like, the big peaks are these things that we did that were very special and unusual.
Yeah. Yeah. Really great stuff. I want to shift gears a little bit because some people listening might be thinking, how can I make sure maybe from a little bit more of a brain health or brain, making sure that people's brains stay healthy. I don't know if I know you've done a lot of work with patients that have had memory issues. I'm not sure if you've gotten down the road of like, hey, are there certain, memory games that have been shown to be helpful or neuroprotective as people get older and they want to make sure they don't get dementia, or anything that you've learned along those lines?
Yeah. So when I talk about this stuff, I always feel a little bit like, I feel a little silly, because most memory researchers, you ask them, how can you improve your memory? And you end up talking about a bunch of things that seem to have nothing to do with memory, but they're so important. So the obvious thing that people ask me all the time is like, vitamins, supplements, nootropics, blah, blah, blah. And, as far as I'm concerned, the data that I've seen when I look into these things is not super compelling. Sometimes you'll find some things that produce a very small but statistically significant effect, which means some people who try it, their performance gets better. Some people who try it, they get worse, or some people it doesn't have any effect, right? So the way I look at those kinds of things, I would say that on one hand, if you have a dietary imbalance, you need to address it. So for me, I'm a vegetarian, and I was talking to some friends who are, really they're doctors who study brain health, and they said, "Oh, you need to take vitamin B complex, and you need to also." Like I told them about my cholesterol, like you need to cut your cholesterol and increase your statin dose. So I did both of those, and with the vitamin B complex, I was like, "Oh, I feel a little better," So those kinds of things people absolutely should do. If you're taking some supplement and you feel like it's helping you, that's great. Keep doing it. And as long as your doctor doesn't mind, it's not making you sick, keep doing it, because it's either helping you or it's the placebo effect, which is very powerful and very real, and it's helping you. So either way.
And I think in terms of like brain health, it's just really important to make sure you don't have a major deficiency. Like if your vitamin D or magnesium or potassium, for example, is really low, that could, that could show up potentially. But yes, in general, assuming someone's not super deficient, there's not too many supplements where I've taken them and all of a sudden got some huge burst of energy or, something like that.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah. And actually for me, I do take vitamin D supplement because I'm D deficient. And so all these things is super important for people to get screened as well as you can for these deficiencies. Because sometimes you might think, well, I eat a healthy diet, but just for whatever reason, you have something like that. So then there's like the brain games thing. And there's, again, some evidence that some brain games might produce some effects. I mean, in general, every brain game that people do, you will improve performance at that game, and then the question is, does it generalize to real life? Again, some of these games have been shown to produce these small benefits in real life, and maybe that means some people really benefited from them, right? So all those things, there's maybe something there, but there's so much low-hanging fruit people can go for, and this low-hanging fruit will not just improve your future self 10 years from now, but it can produce very quick improvements in your quality of life soon, So the positives that I tell people, I mean, basically it comes down to physical health and emotional/mental health. So your brain's just a part of your body. And so things that affect your body are going to affect your brain. The brain needs glucose. It gets it through the vasculature. If you have hypertension or high cholesterol or, kind of inflammatory conditions, it's going to affect your brain function badly, And one of the biggest causes of dementia is vascular dementia, from basically tiny strokes that accumulate over time, where people basically get so much brain damage that at some point they just become demented. So, diabetes, death sentence for the brain, right? Terrible for brain function. And in fact, people, when they go into hypoglycemia, you can get acute hippocampal damage from that. But that all sounds bleak and negative, but the positives are things like aerobic exercise, huge benefits in cognition, including memory. And, some people will say, oh, well, it's increasing neurogenesis. It's increasing the number of neurons in the hippocampus. But more than that, you're really reducing inflammation. You're increasing blood flow to the brain. And those factors have big effects. If the brain can turn over, energy more quickly, that's a great thing, right? And that has all sorts of good effects. So sleep, getting good sleep is a big one. One of the things, though, if you shift over to mental health, it's like such a powerful thing. I mean, I have tested people with clinical depression, like 60-year-olds, 65-year-olds, 70-year-olds with clinical depression, who cognitively were worse than people who were in the earliest stages of Alzheimer's disease. Wow. It can be that bad. Now, even people who aren't depressed per se or don't have any psychopathology, the research pretty much shows that people who have a strong sense of purpose, strong relationships. You don't have to be like extroverted and going to parties all the time, but people who invest in healthy, strong relationships and they feel like they have a sense of purpose in their life, whatever it is, volunteering at their church or a job that they love, whatever it is, those people do much, much better cognitively. In fact, I'm collaborating with a researcher who's doing work on superagers. So people whose memory at the age of 80 is the same as it was at the age of 50. And what you find is that they're not all that different from non-superagers. But this is one of the places where they really do seem to differ, is having strong relationships and being very active, physically active. And so I think I take that very, very seriously. There's a whole host of other things, though, that you can do for your health that can help reduce your risk. One of the weird things seems to be like, if you have hearing problems, wear hearing aids. If you have gum disease, see the dentist. A lot of things that people don't think about. I mean, they're just seemingly counterintuitive. They seem to be a big deal. And, I think the thing that people often feel like is, well, behavior change is hard. And I agree. I struggle with this in my own life. But, it doesn't have to be all or none. You definitely don't want to do things that you hate. So for me, like, I walk my dog every morning and I incorporate a little run into it. It's not like, and then I see a personal trainer twice a week. None of this is going to get me into the Ironman triathlon, but it's something, it gets me moving. And it's something that gives me a sense of that I'm taking care of myself, or I'm taking care of my dog. And, so all those things add up to good activities that I can do, likewise, eating better, you can do this. We know air quality and pollution can be a factor in health. Going to a nice place and spending time in nature where the air is clean, do that. There's so many of these things that you can do that will improve your life within days. It's
Right.
And so if I told people, hey, here's this supplement, or here's this drug that we just came up with, it's an experimental drug, and it will like reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease by 75%, but it's going to give you chronic diarrhea and stomach cramps, people would probably line up to take it. And yet, if I tell you, well, here's this whole set of factors that account for about 75% of the cases of dementia that are out there, and these are all addressable with lifestyle factors, that's something that people, and it will have good effects, good side effects, not bad side effects. Will people do it? They should,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, few things for me personally. Obviously, I plan to exercise and continue to eat healthy into my old age and keep inflammation low, make sure I don't get
Mm-hmm.
diabetes, make sure my blood pressure is not high. My father actually suffered from a bunch of those mini strokes that led to dementia slowly over time as well. And I saw that was from him having high blood pressure that he refused to get treated for,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. Right. So
Yep.
definitely very, very aware of all those things. And then, the social relationships, like, it's interesting how you can see like a Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, who, are pretty known for being pretty unhealthy in terms of the diet and not exercising. But yet, because I believe that because they were so socially and active with their mind, active every day, doing meetings, people coming to their houses for dinners and lunches and all these things. So for me, I noticed the difference between, even when my father retired and stopped working, and then after he stopped playing tennis, and there was just less and less social interactions, and you see just the deterioration happen more and more. So I think that can't be stressed enough about just keeping friendships, keeping active. And me personally, I don't really want to retire. Maybe I don't want to work as hard as when I'm older, but I want to be doing something, maybe managing my investments at the very least, or doing something where I'm staying active and stimulated.
Yeah, this is actually something I talk about in my book at the end, which is that it's like, if you look at the natural progression of the way the brain develops over time, it kind of tracks how humans should have been behaving throughout most of human history, right? So you're a kid, you're wandering around learning through play and observation, and your brain's optimized for that. You're an adult, you have to like plan for the future so that your kids can be looked after and, supported and stuff like that. So that's how your brain's optimized. Later on, it's not so much about forming your own memories as it is sharing the knowledge and the wisdom that you've acquired over this lifetime of memories that you have. And so, yeah, we're not as plastic. We're not as good at learning new things. We are still good, but maybe not as good. But our functions change. Our role should change. And I think this is something that people need to really think about is, okay, well, I'm retiring, but I have a lot to offer. What can I do with that? How can I take, because in the olden days, it's like, oh yeah, you'd have a tribe of people and the elders would be not only kind of running the show often, but they'd be the ones who would be like teaching children, here's how medicine works. Here's the language, here's the stories of our culture, right? And so I think this is a big, big problem that we have in America and so-called Western societies is people are much more isolated and they don't have that kind of community connection. And I think it's responsible for a lot of terrible things right now. I know it's kind of like a cliche to talk about the epidemic of loneliness and all that, but it really does. I think people need to have this kind of connection with the world around them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very well said. Well, Dr. Ranganath, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure. It was a lot of fun. I'm actually buying your audiobook as soon as we get off right now. I can't wait to listen to it and highly encourage others to do the same. Where can people get the book, follow you, learn from you?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So the book is Why We Remember, and people can get it. It's published by Doubleday in the U.S. You can get it pretty much anywhere you get books. It's audiobook, ebook, now out in paperback as of today. So you can get it in whatever format you like, you can get it. Likewise, in Europe, there's paperback and hardback, and it's available globally for anybody of your listeners who are anywhere else. And then if you want more, you want to keep up on what I'm doing, either with memory stuff, some random tips that I might have. I think I posted a smoothie recipe once, my strange acquisitions of musical instruments or whatever, or live performances. You can follow me on Instagram. My tag is the Memory Doc. And I've also got socials on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. So yeah, definitely people can keep it. Oh, and if you go to my website, charanranganath.com, I have a sign up for a mailing list. I don't spam people. In fact, I've sent nothing to anyone so far, but I am going to get my stuff together and send out kind of things like tips for brain health, tips for improving day-to-day memory and so forth.
Amazing. Can't wait for it. Really looking forward to it. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast here today. This was great, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Talora.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, can you please leave us a rating or review and subscribe? I've realized that while we have actually increased our downloads a lot, we're actually getting a lot of downloads, which I'm really happy about. We actually have very few ratings. And I realized that I've never asked people really to rate much. So I'm asking you now if you could please rate and review and subscribe. And if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to anyone that you think will get value out of this. Also, if you haven't checked out our line of products at buypeakperformance.com, you get 20% off your first order. That's www.buypeakperformance.com. We have some incredible products, including our organic high-altitude coffee. If you don't know this, coffee is one of the most heavily sprayed with pesticides out of any crop. So it's really important that you drink organic coffee. We've gone above and beyond to source what we believe is the highest quality and healthiest organic coffee in the world. We're also famous for our organic green superfood powder. You can get 20% off of that as well at buypeakperformance.com. We also have an organic vegan and paleo plant protein. See, most of the vegan proteins out there are using brown rice protein, which is really not a good source of protein, and it's also a grain. And if you're paleo, you know that grains tend to cause inflammation in some cases for some people. And so we wanted to make one that was paleo friendly and vegan and organic. We made an amazing amino acid profile, so it's really one of the best plant proteins for muscle building. So you can check out Peak Performance Organic Plant Protein. You can find that on our website. Of course, all our products are on Amazon as well. So thanks again. And again, please, if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to someone who you feel can get value out of it. And please leave us a rating, review, and subscribe. Thank you.